Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. Over the next half an hour, we'll be looking beyond the business headlines by giving you in-depth perspective on the stories that are affecting all of us. Coming up on today's show, the 50th World Economic Forum has been taking place this week, and on the sidelines it was announced that Nigeria will become the latest country to partner with the group on an initiative to tackle plastic pollution. I'll be speaking with Kristin Hughes, the director at Global Plastic Action Partnership in Geneva, Switzerland. She'll be telling me all the details regarding this monumental agreement. And with the global education system in a state of disarray due to the COVID-19 pandemic, I'll be speaking with Tom Crombie in Edinburgh, Scotland. He's the director of My Online Schooling and argues that home learning for the foreseeable future might just be the only way to ensure children stay properly educated during this unprecedented period. Then later, author and human rights lawyer Ayo Shogunro will be joining me from Lagos, Nigeria, to share his thoughts on what Africa can expect from this Joe Biden administration. But first, let's start the programme with news from here in the UK. Earlier this week, the official death toll from COVID-19 in Britain surpassed 100,000. This is by far the highest death toll in Europe and one of the worst in the world. During a televised news conference on Tuesday, the country's chief medical officer, Chris Whitty, said Britain will see more deaths from coronavirus before a vaccination programme takes effect. Critics have accused Boris Johnson's Conservative government of being slow to appreciate the threat of COVID-19, to impose lockdowns and to procure protective equipment for health workers. A recent poll by Opinium found just 51% of voters approve of the government's handling of the pandemic.
On this day, I should just really repeat that I am deeply sorry for every life that has been lost. And of course, as Prime Minister, I take full responsibility for everything that the government has done. What I can tell you is that we truly did everything we could and continue to do everything that we can to minimise loss of life and to minimise suffering in what has been a very, very difficult stage and a very, very difficult crisis for our country. And we will continue to do that, just as every government that is affected by this crisis around the world is continuing to do the same.
Well, for more on this, I'm now being joined by our business correspondent, Simon Pusey. Simon, the Prime Minister gave a pretty gloomy address on Tuesday morning to the nation. 100,000 deaths, that's a huge, horrible milestone, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and it's not a surprise because we knew that the number of deaths were going up, the number of cases have been going down in the last few weeks, but obviously with a backlog of about 2 weeks that we knew we were going to hit this 100,000 figure. It's worth pointing out that this is 100,000 deaths within 28 days of a positive test, so there is a margin for error there. That's not going to be everyone who's died from that, but obviously the large proportion will have. And yeah, it's a terrible figure, and I think the government, it's really pushed the government to do some further things because there's been so much condemnation of the way that we've reached this figure and the style in which we've done it. So eventually they're looking at airports and quarantining people when they come in from certain countries, making people take tests and go to hotels, which a lot of other countries have done. And I think a lot of people here will be questioning why that wasn't done earlier. It is a different country, and London is a different place to places like sort of Australia or New Zealand, but still people are questioning that. Also the schools, we've heard that schools are not going to reopen after half term like was possibly mooted. So I think these new figures have really kicked the government to do a few more things. And we've also heard, based on the economy, a couple of more grim milestones. 200,000 people are thought to have lost their jobs in the last 3 months up to November. That is bigger, and unemployment rate, has hit 5% for the first time in more than 4 years. So everything really coming to a head. In response to this, Rishi Sunak has suggested that unemployment might peak at 7.5% later this year. So that's a lot higher even than it is now. He says in response to that come March the 3rd and the new budget that he's going to give further support to businesses and to people. It's thought he might spend about £20 million on that, £20 billion, on that to sort of support people in terms of universal credit and also businesses that might be struggling to go under. So there's lots of bad news out there, definitely. Again, every week, or we've been saying for the last few weeks, the ray of sunshine on the horizon is the vaccination rollout, which seems to be going well. It's about 75% now of people over the age of 80 who've had it, and it seems to be going much smoother than anyone had ever thought might happen. And I think part of that is because the government changed their mind based on doing one shots as opposed to 2 inoculations. They're doing 1 inoculation, which I think protects you up to a point. You need both inoculations to be fully protected, but one of them will do quite a good job. And I think it was that decision that they took, which means that many more people are getting vaccinated maybe than other European countries. But I guess what their hope is that the extra measures they're taking in terms of at airports and also with schools is going to mean the number of deaths are coming down, but we're still looking at about 1,600 deaths every day, which is absolutely incredible. But the number of cases are going down, and I think the only sort of the things that we can keep trying to stay positive here in this country about is the number of vaccinations that are getting rolled out. Hopefully they will begin to have an effect soon.
Thank you, Simon. Here's some other news from across the globe. The World Economic Forum has been taking place this week with the Davos agenda focused on re-establishing global strategic partnerships in a bid to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic. The annual gathering of political and business leaders usually takes place in Davos, a small town in the Swiss Alps. However, this year, its 50th, the conference is virtual. One of the other key issues is sustainability and curbing the climate crisis. On the sidelines, it was announced that Nigeria will officially join the group's Global Plastic Action Partnership, which is a platform that works with governments, businesses and civil society to translate plastic pollution commitments into concrete solutions. In 2018, Nigeria was estimated to have discharged around 200,000 tonnes of plastic waste into the ocean. For more on this, I'm now being joined by Christine Hughes in Geneva, Switzerland. She's the director at Global Plastic Action Partnership. Kristen Hughes, thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global. It's all exciting because there's a new initiative. The National Plastic Action Partnership, a little bit of a mouthful, has now partnered with Nigeria and the World Economic Forum. Can you tell us a little bit about what this is going to entail?
Yes, very happily to do that. Thank you for inviting me. I'm Kristen Hughes. I oversee the Global Plastic Action Partnership. And as you said, it is a bit of a mouthful, but what we're trying to do is work closely with governments to create a multi-stakeholder platform, bringing together civil society, governments, and leading corporates to really address the issue of plastic waste and pollution. And we do this through a 3-pillar approach, really focusing on pulling those conversations together, connecting the dots such that people can amplify each other's projects, learn from one another, share best practices. We'll also be supporting the government with a baseline assessment such that we can better understand exactly where the plastic waste flows are coming from and how the government can think about addressing them.
Absolutely. It's brilliant that Nigeria's finally got involved. You've been doing this with Ghana over the past year. Can you tell us how that's been going? Of course, I can imagine, COVID-19 must have presented some challenges, but then because you have been doing it with a neighbouring country, those lessons that can be learnt can be transferred over, can't they?
Yes, indeed. And actually, you're right. We've had great success with Ghana. We have such a wonderful relationship with the ministry there, the MESTI ministry, as well as a number of other partners, a lot of the governments, Canada and the UK, who helped to bring this partnership together, who will also be super supportive of this effort also in Nigeria. We also have corporate engagement partners like the Coca-Cola company, PepsiCo, Dow, and Nestle, who again are really excited about how we can replicate this partnership also in Nigeria. The World Bank is one of our strongest partners in Ghana and has been incredibly supportive of all of our efforts there. To date, we have assessed and created that baseline assessment, as I mentioned before, to help the government of Ghana to understand where the plastic waste is coming from. And from there, we're now in the process of creating what we call an action roadmap, which will outline the various steps that the government can consider taking to address the plastic menace.
Christine Hughes, the director at the National Plastic Action Partnership, which has just joined forces with the Nigerian government. Excellent. Thanks so much for joining me on the show. To other news now. California eased strict COVID-19 stay-at-home orders on Monday, allowing restaurants to reopen for outdoor dining and greater social mixing, as public health authorities reported slower infection rates and hospitalizations. The most populous US state, with some 40 million residents, has reported over 3 million COVID-19 cases and more than 36,000 deaths from the disease. Governor Gavin Newsom announced that the region has tripled its pace of vaccinations and hopes to give 1 million additional shots over the next 10 days. Google has threatened to remove its search engine from Australia over the nation's attempt to make the tech giant share royalties with news publishers. Australia is introducing a world-first law to make Google, Facebook and potentially other tech companies pay media outlets for their news content. But the US firms have fought back, warning the law would make them withdraw some of their services. Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison said lawmakers would not yield to threats. Now over to our next topic. According to data compiled by Global Minnesota, more than 91% of students worldwide have had their education negatively impacted by COVID-19. As millions of schools remain closed, educators have turned to online learning platforms over the past 12 months. One of those platforms is run by our next guest. Tom Crombie is the director of My Online Schooling. He joins me now from Edinburgh in Scotland. Tom Crombie, thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global. I think across the world we are starting to realise that one of the biggest victims of COVID-19 is children. I know every government are grappling with the way that they can resolve the issue, but I've got to say, certainly in the West, we're starting to see that perhaps online schooling may not be the best solution for children. However, you disagree with that, and your business model appears to prove that online schooling may be the best option in the foreseeable future.
Yes, absolutely. We completely agree that there have been challenges. There have been challenges in allowing every young person over the school lockdown phase to access online education. But for a long-term solution, we are big advocates that online learning is going to play a very pivotal part in the future of education. At My Online Schooling, we've been teaching primary, secondary lessons online to over 1,500 pupils across 70 different nations for over 4 years now. We've seen incredible success, not just academic success with our 97% pass rate, but also in the engagement and enjoyment with learning. We've allowed young people to access learning that perhaps had challenges accessing it through the bricks and mortar schools or mainstream education before. They're able to access a really high quality British education taught live and interactive by fully qualified teachers. They enjoy the lessons. They're able to get a similar experience to what they would get in the classroom. And this is now opening up access and inclusion to so many young people across the globe.
Absolutely. At least it's an alternative, isn't it? But there are so many nuances when it comes to, children and access to education, especially for you, because like you said, you were one of the lucky ones, Tom. You cashed in before the pandemic, and look what the past 12 months have been. I know, your subscriptions have surged, and long may it continue. But as you are seeking to expand, particularly in the global south, we have millions of viewers, for example, in Nigeria, and unfortunately for some children the infrastructure is just not there. If they're not in front of a blackboard, they're just not going to access this education. How would you seek to challenge that, or to assist with the millions upon millions of children that just don't have internet? And I think it's fair to say that we've also had that problem in some parts of the UK, haven't we?
Of course, we have had that problem in the UK, and we do hope that over time that access to resources, to the infrastructure and to the internet is going to improve. Over lockdown, we've actually seen a real growth in our pupil numbers throughout Africa, particularly in Nigeria, with a lot of growth of recent for young people looking to access a really quality education. So we believe that we are at the start of this journey still. We believe we are the pioneers in what's to come.
Well, Tom Crombie, the director of My Online Learning. Thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global. Coming up on Channel's Business Global, I'll be exploring the possibilities of a renewed US-Africa foreign policy under President Joe Biden with author and human rights lawyer Ayo Shogunuro, who'll be joining me from Lagos, Nigeria. See you after the break. Welcome back to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. In a moment, I'll be speaking with author and human rights lawyer Ayo Shogunuro. But before then, here's some company news for you. Fashion retailer Boohoo has paid £55 million to acquire the brand of collapsed rival Debenhams, with the intention of relaunching it online only, leaving thousands of jobs out in the cold. The cut price deal for the brand name, intellectual property and customer lists will eventually result in the closure of Debenhams' 118 remaining stores, as none of the sites are included in the sale. The 242-year-old department store started a liquidation process last month after failing to secure a last-minute rescue deal. The developments leave more than 10,000 staff facing the prospect of redundancy. Facebook has launched its Facebook News tab in the UK after completing deals with many of the country's major news providers, including Sky News, the Financial Times and The Guardian. Available within the Facebook app, the News tab will feature stories from what the social media giant describes as hundreds of leading national, local and lifestyle outlets. The financial deal aims to address some of the concerns that Facebook and Google are forcing many news publishers out of business. Recent figures published by Sky News from research firm eMarketer revealed 61% of UK media advertising was going to either Facebook or Google. Now over to our next topic. What can Africa expect from the Joe Biden administration is a question gaining a lot of traction on the continent and within the diaspora. Clearly, he has plenty of pressing domestic issues that need to be addressed. However, unlike his predecessors, as the world evolves, Africa is no longer a continent that you can ignore. For more on this, I'm now being joined by author and human rights lawyer Ayo Shogunuro. Ayo Shogunuro, thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global. There are a lot of people asking, what can we expect in Africa from a Joe Biden administration? We don't have much detail, though I suppose his reversal of the executive order of the kind of Africa visa ban, which really affected Nigeria and so many other countries, is a little insight, and perhaps, relations can be improved. Do you agree?
Yes, certainly. I mean, the Trump presidency did not really concern itself with Africa because it felt more comfortable again with countries that it felt it could have some kind of transactional relationship with. And these tend to be countries that were willing to give something up in exchange for their relationship, with which most African countries tend not to have. And the way the Trump presidency went about its relationship with Africa has been a little bit negative, calling us shit-old countries, calling South Africa a mess, declaring that there was a genocide of white people in South Africa, and situations like this, which hopefully the Biden presidency, which has positioned itself as an inclusive and more diversity-oriented presidency, would change and at the very least revert to what used to be the case of socio-cultural interaction between us and the US.
It's quite interesting because you cited some pretty awful remarks that out of the President Donald Trump made about Africa, but then a lot of people in Africa had a love-hate relationship. Let's not talk about the Pentecostal pastors that all appeared to really love him. But when you speak to African experts, they're a little bit weary of Biden. And I think that's because, of course, he spent 8 years as Obama's vice president. The black community had so much hope, probably too much hope, resting on the shoulders of Barack Obama. He didn't really show that much interest in Africa. Some would say it was a little bit lackluster. Are you hearing that some people are not as optimistic as others maybe?
So well, we have to look at this from two broad perspectives. There is the first perspective, which is the fact that no matter who is the president, the US rarely does anything that is not in the US interests. It's always America first in one form or the other. Never Africa first or Europe first or Asia first. It's always America first. However, how that America First is couched can have different impacts globally. So, for example, under the Obama regime and even prior to this, you had a situation where US imperialism, as it was and as it still is, was couched in the language of human rights and democracy. That meant that even though they did not directly concern themselves with issues in Africa, they maintained a very public position on solidarity for democratic governments and for the protection of human rights on the continent. And so in cases where they felt that there was an egregious breach of these values, which they call their own values, they would, for example, refuse foreign aid, or they would, at the very least, impose sanctions on officials from governments that they felt are defaulting. So while this might not be a direct Africa policy, it did have some trickle-down effects on the social, political situation and environment in these African countries. We had African leaders who are wary about behaving in outrageous ways because they knew that the US government would come down very hard on them. And so while that perspective is quite valid, and it's one that we want to, at the very least, encourage, because we need people to monitor democracy all over the world, not just the US, but other countries too, to monitor democracy in other countries. There is a counterpart, which, like I mentioned earlier, is the fact that we should always distrust any form of interventionism, any form of policy that tries to interfere or create some kind of imperial system in the African continent. And Biden, even though he was under the Obama administration, I think he himself has more on his plates right now than the Obama administration did when it comes to domestic issues. America is currently at war with itself. America is currently facing a pandemic like the rest of us, but with much more devastating losses than in other countries. And America is facing a serious economic and unemployment crisis. So with all of this, I think it is safe to say that Biden is not going to concern himself with an imperial attitude towards other countries for now. So I think we can receive the gift of the democratic monitoring without fearing the idea of imperialism.
Thank you, Ayo. You raised some really fascinating points there. I kind of felt like I was one of your students in a lecture. I wish we had more time to go into the geopolitics, but we are running out of time. Thank you very much for mentioning America being at war with itself, because that leads nicely into my final question, which is about the January the 6th insurrection. We've already had Museveni in Uganda asking Bobby Wine not to act like Donald Trump and show evidence of vote rigging. Are we going to see more of that? Do you possibly think that that stain of that siege at the Capitol Hill will make the African political establishment turn their back on America even more than it had been prior?
Frankly, I do not think that will happen. However, what I think will happen is that people would shape that incident around various narratives, sometimes even diametrically opposite narratives, because while those of us who put our biases in the camp of democracy and democratic values would say that was a serious test of American democracy, and there was an attempt to, overturn that democracy. The democracy ultimately prevailed. There would be other people who would say, oh no, even if America itself can do this, then what is the problem with us doing the same? If an American president can resist the results of an election, we also can resist the results of an election.
Absolutely.
Or even further, say that, look, whatever the official results are in the American election was what everybody went with. So whatever the official results are in our own election would also be what everyone goes with. But I think one would always be able to point out that American election and electoral system are not controlled from the White House. They are not controlled directly from the federal government. If anything, it's a highly decentralized process where low-level officials in counties and states governments tend to be the determining factors on the outcome of the election rather than high-level officials at the federal government. But what we see in Africa is that high-level officials dictate not just to the people at the grassroots, but even to media on what to say, on what to announce as outcome. So I think it will be very hard for any person to take the argument seriously that what has happened in America could help to solidify dictatorial impulses in African governments.
Ayo Shogunro, thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global. It's been fascinating, and we're definitely going to have you back because it wasn't enough time. But thank you so much for joining me on the show. Sadly, that's all we have time for today, but do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channel's Business Global. Goodbye.